everything working good?
All good. It's kind of a crapshoot with us sometimes. Never forgive Apple for removing the HDMI port from the MacBooks.
Oh, really? It's gone?
Yeah, it's just USB-C. That's all you've got.
I have a older MacBook Air that, you know, still has regular USB slots and all that.
Oh, yeah. Well, my personal one has it, so as a backup, I could run upstairs and switch to it, but just don't have to do that.
Is this lighting okay? Do you have anything that needs better lighting for your slides?
I don't think
Or?
so. No, it's
Yeah, well, we have graphics.
It's just going to be a bunch of pictures and
Okay, all right.
stories, so
Okay.
nothing too complex.
Yeah, when we have graphics people, then we have to be careful with that because stuff gets all washed out.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
Yeah, so we have people usually gather around 10:30 and we'll have donuts and coffee down here and then the talk will start around 10:40 or so.
Okay, cool.
Kind of gather. But there's no rush. We have the room till noon.
Till noon.
You know, lunch will be delivered around 12:15 back upstairs.
Okay.
So,
Then we should wrap up around, what, around 1:30 or so, you think? Or
yeah.
okay.
Y'all got a little bit of snow a couple weeks ago, right? I saw maybe just a dusting.
We did, yeah, I guess a couple weeks
Yeah.
ago we did. It was weird because it was like in the 40s,
Oh, okay.
or like the upper 40s, it was
Yeah.
like the 50s the day before. It was mild, and then like if you hadn't been watching the forecast, you wouldn't know. And then you wake up the next morning and it looked like a blizzard outside because it happened to be windy and it was like stuff coming down, but it was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. I saw, one of our friends from Library of Congress, I thought was her on Twitter, and she had pictures outside of her office window.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll have to see. Michael was saying that they have two buildings, and he didn't know if they were the arbor reading windows in the nice pretty building, or if they were the Library of Congress is so pretty.
Yeah, it is. So I have a membership card there, but I have not, because you can just go work from there.
Oh, cool.
I've not made it, it's just kind of inconvenient from where I'm at in the city, but I really want to get over there.
Yeah, I definitely can see the appeal. Hey, Sam. Good. Hey, Patrick, this is one of our new faculty members that I mentioned.
Sam. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I was telling him we've hired 5 new faculty members in the past 2 years, so yeah. Yeah, Sam is in our web science and libraries group.
Okay. So you probably work together on some of that research.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, in the past I did some biometrics work with using my emails for biometrics work.
Okay. And how long have you been here?
So it's like 3 months.
Yeah, so
Okay, so
he's
pretty new.
yeah.
I was at Cal State for more than 2 years.
Okay.
I finished my PhD, so yeah.
I can't talk to him this week because he graduated from Texas A&M.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you watched college football,
No.
but I'm from Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
I'm a huge
Yeah.
LSU fan. And,
One after like, I don't know
wasted
how many years,
5
20
hours
something
of my
years.
life, watching that game. It was wild.
It's just crazy game. Oh my God. I
When was that?
sleepy.
What's that?
When was that?
That was just
Last
Saturday.
Saturday, yeah.
Saturday.
Yeah, it went into 7 overtimes, and it was
Oh my
74 to
God.
72.
Oh my God.
The score.
We're robbed.
Yeah, what we were saying is when the two teams play basketball, I'm sure the score won't be that high.
I was up like 3 o'clock or so. It's like, I couldn't sleep.
Oh.
I was like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was texting my dad, because they're still in the Baton Rouge area. I was texting him during the games, and like in the third overtime, and he knows I go to bed early. He was like, "Are you still watching the game?" I was like, "It's overtime. I invested. I have to stay up until it's over, even though I'm really sleepy and almost don't care at this point because it's gone on so long." Hey.
I'm gonna try and go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Let me change that. So you go up here and take a right. It's the first set of doors on the right.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, good to see you. Glad you made it.
Is everything on?
Good.
This is all about.
Yeah.
Is he going to be talking about the actual developments or just about?
I'm not sure. I mean, but so what he's going to do is going to talk for like 30 minutes, and then he'll be open for questions. So anything you want to ask him, yeah, please do. So yeah, that'll probably help.
I want to thank you for that recommendation. Definitely helped. I got into the EOS,
Oh, awesome.
school, but also still figuring it out.
Okay. Great.
They're definitely trying to branch out the technology field from out of the medical school, relying on like databases and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Virginia, the facility that a lot of development close to UVA.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
They're doing something like databases for cancer research.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I think the kind of medical data stuff has gotten really big. I have a friend who's faculty at UNC, and so he does kind of medical data analysis and visualization. I don't know, he came and gave a talk in the past year, and he was doing, working with hospitals and stuff and visualizing medical records and, the outcome of experiments and things like that.
Yeah, I've done that. I've seen that.
Yeah, you can, but his name is David Dots, and so you can go to the website and look for archive videos from the previous colloquiums, if that's all. All right.
So I was thinking like how much money you get when I was like game, right? I think 105 or 110,000 something. 5 hours, so much like business. All the positions and money. People like everybody now saying that, oh, every penny is worth like 70 million. I think we are right now. I'm going to do something.
No, I can see it.
For some reason, Georgia, like every year, they have like at least 4, 5, like 5-star bedrooms. I don't know like, what's going on. We like barely get 1 or 2, like 5-star one or maybe 1.
Yeah, I got you guys.
So Steve, I just sent you a note about the 7th. Okay.
So I've already edited his name in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I had actually had to
I created a calendar entry for you, but
I'm here to see what
messed
they
up
do.
on the selection of when you have a dozen Google calendars like
Right,
I
right, right.
it was sitting in my personal calendar instead of on the
Oh,
department
yeah,
colloquial
yeah.
calendar.
Yeah, that's fine. Because I'm essentially giving that talk at the Library of Congress like the week after. It's like, well, I'll practice if there's no colloquium slot, but it's fine.
So don't be offended if I leave midway. through.
Okay. All right.
I actually expect a phone call, so.
Okay. Well, I think she's only going to talk for about a half an hour, and the rest is going to be Q&A. So it may,
Okay.
may end up being an actual
Okay.
time to
Sounds
walk
good.
out.
Sounds good. What's up?
You did?
I was trying to decide if I want to go upstairs and get a jacket.
It's always cold.
On the other hand, it might not keep me awake.
With fancy shoes, fancy pants.
Right here, the fourth one.
Sent you an email about another cloakroom. Is that okay?
So, it depends on how far up along the email chain you are. So you sent one.
I sent it and then walked out.
Michelle had that slot, and Michelle said, that's okay, I yield, and I wrote back to you,
Okay,
said, okay.
okay.
Michelle yielded the slot. So.
All right, excellent. All that occurred while I was riding over here, I guess. So.
Okay, our speaker is Patrick Stoddard from the Army Digital Service, and he's going to talk to us about that service and the U.S. Digital Service in general. He's going to talk for a bit and then have time, a good bit of time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please don't be shy. Go ahead and ask.
Thanks. Yeah, we will have plenty of time for questions at the end, so I'll kind of run through this, but hopefully that'll prompt some ideas. So, as Michelle mentioned, my name is Patrick Stoddard. I am a part of a group called the Defense Digital Service at the Department of Defense. Before I joined that team, I was starting and scaling software companies. So I was building tools to help improve communication in schools and government, and later building tools that allow people to contact lawmakers on issues they care about. It's not what I'm here to talk about today, though. So I'm going to get a little more into our projects and kind of the work that we do at EDS. But first, I'm just curious, anybody here active duty military or reserve or guard? Two? Okay, cool. Anybody ever worked as a civilian in government or government adjacent, maybe a contractor? Okay, a couple folks. Anybody started their own company or know someone who has? Okay. Okay, oh, the same hands, interesting. Okay, cool. That'll just kind of help me understand what we've got. So, the Defense Digital Service is part of something called the United States Digital Service. Actually had the site up here before, usds.gov. USDS was actually created by the Obama administration after healthcare.gov's failed launch back in 2014. Some of you may remember that. So this was sort of one of the crowning policy achievements for the past administration, and the IT systems were a total failure when they rolled out. But the interesting thing is that by the government standards, the administration had done everything right. They wrote a lengthy requirements document, they found a well-known federal government contractor, they awarded a contract, they gave it to them, and a few years later they expected to get something back. The only problem is when they went to flip the switch, the whole thing choked because it turned out it wasn't designed with users and it wasn't designed to scale, because who knew that we would need to do that. And so at the time, the administration had this sort of crazy idea to call in engineers from tech companies, big tech companies in Silicon Valley, to come in and just come for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever you can to try and stand the site back up and get it working. And so a small handful of folks came in from California, and they were expecting to deal with this really complex mess that was maybe well engineered but missing a few things here and there, and for it to be a pretty advanced technical problem. Turns out they arrived and they did novel things like installing application performance monitoring, because the contractors that were maintaining this thing were using CNN as their performance monitoring. So there would be a story on CNN saying that healthcare.gov was down, and that was how they knew the site was down, which not exactly ideal for a system like this. So things that to folks in the private sector would be pretty painfully obvious, or simple, or included as part of your tech stack, were just nowhere to be found in this project. And so over the course of a few weeks, the team was able to get the site stable and out the door and processing people. And sort of out of this was founded this agency that I'm a part of now called the United States Digital Service. And it was founded on the idea that projects like the one I just described, healthcare.gov, are perhaps more the rule than the exception when it comes to large-scale government IT projects. So if you fast forward to today, USDS and my team at DDS are focused on bringing in the best talent. So we hire software engineers, we hire designers, we hire product managers, mostly from the private sector. to come in for tours of duty, short-term tours of duty in government. So nobody that we bring in is permanent, including myself, including our leadership. Everybody is there for a short period of time. We ask them if they can come in for 3 to 6 months. That's great. You can contribute in that amount of time. If you can come in for 2 years or so, that's even better. But after 4 years, we actually kick you back out. So your term expires, and the idea is that you go back to the private sector. So USDS is actually, at the time it was created as well, it was actually modeled after similar teams in the UK. So the UK government has something called the Government Digital Service. There are other countries that have these too. Singapore, Canada has set up the Canadian Digital Service, all sort of modeled after the same idea that we can bring in private sector experts to lend their expertise to government service for a short period of time, and that we can create value while doing that. So the Defense Digital Service is the DoD outpost of USDS. We have teams at a variety of different agencies across the federal government. We have a team at Health and Human Services, at Homeland Security, at Veterans Affairs, at Small Business, and a couple others. And across all the agencies, we're actually fairly small. We're about 200 people, small for a government agency at least. And our team at DDS is about 40. A lot of our counterparts at other agency teams work on more citizen-facing services. So if you apply for a global entry, for example, through CBP, that's going to be through a system that we just recently redesigned and relaunched. If you're logging into a lot of government websites and you use something called login.gov, that's a site for managing identity proofing across the federal government that one of our teams stood up. But at the Department of Defense, we're a little bit less public citizen-facing just by nature of the mission of our department. So we in particular work on areas where technology is failing the mission of national defense. That is really our directive. We choose our own projects, so we work on problems of impact across the department. We're not sort of handed a priority list. We see what's going on, and we go out and we solve things. The Department of Defense, I don't know if you know this, is the largest department of the federal government. It's also, I think, the largest employer in the world. There are over 2 million service members, about 1 million civilians on top of that, and then another couple million government contractors who have a relationship with the department in some way. So think about that. That's a population of a large city or a small country even. Our task then is enormous. So what I want to talk about today is how a team of nerds form a Rebel Alliance to disrupt technology within the Pentagon. That's really what we are. We call ourselves the Rebel Alliance. We call ourselves a SWAT team of nerds. We go in and we solve problems where technology has failed a mission. This is actually our official door sign in the Pentagon, the Rebel Alliance. I'm going to talk a lot about, as I go through this, different fights that we take on. Our team is not an organic growth out of the military. We are sort of an anomaly. I like to think we're sort of a weird glitch in the matrix, and we probably shouldn't exist as a team because we stand out so much from the rest of the organizations in that 5-sided building up in DC. And there are days where I feel like we probably shouldn't be there, where maybe we're not wanted there. But there are more than that days where I realize things are so bad in the federal government and the Department of Defense that we are desperately needed there, and that technical people are desperately needed for that mission. And so, for that reason, we call ourselves the Rebel Alliance. This is another one of our door signs. This is actually one of our classified spaces, so it's always fun walking, seeing tour groups. There are tour groups that walk through the Pentagon, usually 20, 25 people or so. It's always fun seeing them walk by this office and kind of freak out, and we'll tell them we can't let them inside because it's classified, which it is. So I want to talk first about my first few days at DDS. I never thought I would work in the government. I mentioned, I came from founding software companies. I went from organizations of 20 to 30 people that I helped build myself from the ground up to, again, the largest employer in the world. It was quite a culture shock. It was not really, I didn't really know what to expect. My vision for myself, my plan for myself was never to pursue a career in government. It still isn't, but here I am. And so I want to talk a little bit about my first few days at DDS. The second day on the team, I actually found myself in a dimly lit conference room on a military base, on a naval base north of Chicago, in the headquarters of a command called the United States Military Entrance Processing Command. They are responsible for the enlistment of all new service members for all 5 branches of the Armed Forces, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and the Coasties, which are technically part of DHS, but we still enlist them, don't worry about it. And I was sitting in this conference room in like your typical 1950s government building, pretty awful, not well ventilated, wondering what I had gotten myself into. And I was there with a couple of my colleagues, and we were going around the room asking questions of the government staff that was based there, and trying to understand the nuances of the software that they use, the core software system they use to in-process these 500,000 people every single year across, at 65 locations across the country. And trying to understand what problems they were having with it. So it turns out this software was built mostly in the early 90s. I think it was completed in about 94. Pretty much hasn't been touched since then. It's sort of frozen in time. So mostly in Oracle, Java Stack, and it's all hosted on-premise and on aging hardware. So I actually only just recently got to go down there, but they have a data center in the basement that is more like a server closet, where all of these enlistment records are kept. This is important data, by the way. It's every service member, it's the start of their military record, right? So it's their medical records, it's the aptitude tests they take when they enlist, it's their family history, criminal background, it's everything. And it's basically sitting in this server closet downstairs in this kind of crappy government building. It floods sometimes, the power goes out, you know, things happen. They just switch back to paper, it's fine. And I actually call this system really a paper-based system. The reason I call it that is because every time you save a record in this system, a printer somewhere in your building automatically spits out an updated piece of paper with the updated record. We're not really sure why. It just does it automatically. You actually can't stop it. It just like spits out paper constantly. And so there's literally paper everywhere. And to give you an idea of how bad this system is, sometime a decade ago, they tried to update it. They actually pushed an update that caused the mouse, when you were in the application, caused the mouse to behave erratically. I'm not really sure why. And so their IT shop did what any reasonable shop would do, and they disabled the mouse for the application, so you just can't use the mouse anymore. That's a feature, not a bug. So now, when you want to save a record, we've got to tab through the record, tab through the fields, whatever. And then when you want to save it, you hit Control F9. It's like super intuitive key combinations they came up with for it. This is fine. Like, this is just what we expect from our government technology now, right? How many of you have ever used a government website? In some capacity, right? If you've ever dealt with the DMV, you've probably dealt with that, right? Local, state, and federal. It's even worse for government employees. The tools that we give people are not sufficient for their jobs, especially in the military. But it's just what we expect from the government now. So when you enlist, you actually go to a processing station. Folks that were active duty, are you enlisted, or did you enlist? Do you remember both? So do you remember a MEPS? Yeah, okay. So you go to a MEPS, you go to a military entrance processing station that's run by this command. You take a medical exam, you take an aptitude test, you take a job, you get fingerprinted, you go through this whole rigmarole. And it's a pretty scary process for a young recruit. So think, you're typically right out of high school, imagine 17-year-old you sort of going through this process to make this commitment. And before you leave that facility, you will raise your right hand and you will take an oath of enlistment. And that actually starts your active duty career in the military. It also is the start of this whole process, again, is the start of your military record. And after you do that, you're going to get on a bus and go to boot camp. But guess what happens to all that paper that's generated throughout the process? Remember, the printers are spitting out paper left and right? It gets stuffed into a mill envelope. They make some photocopies of it. And by the way, these packets are between like 40 and 100 pages thick. It just depends on how much of a medical record you have and other things. They get stuffed into a manila envelope, they get wrapped in packing tape, and they hand it to the kid that just is getting shipped off to boot camp, and they say, don't lose this kid. The reason they say that is because that is the authoritative copy of their record. And granted, there hasn't been a ton of history yet, but they're gathering things. If you broke a bone in first grade, you have to go get your original medical records to support that. It's pretty detailed. And this is the authoritative record. You're sending these kids with it. And they go off by themselves. They get on a bus, they get on a plane, they fly to wherever the boot camp is. And so one of the things that we do at DDS is we try to find out where the breakdowns in the system are. So when we encounter a problem, we don't always take people at their word, right? We trust but verify. We ask people that are stakeholders at all parts of the process exactly what they're doing to try to understand what the actual origin of the problem is. Because a lot of times people assume, in government it's such a large organization, it's easy to assume that the person a couple desks over, a couple buildings over, or a couple towns over is handling things one way, when in reality things might go a totally different path. And we found out as part of this process that almost nobody from that first command that does all the enlistment processing has actually been to a boot camp and seen where these packets end up. So you say, yeah, well, the Marines and the Navy and the services, they ask us for these packets, so we just create these packets. And we're trying to figure out why the hell they have these packets and why they can't send it electronically or some other way. I mean, FedEx, right? And so, about a year ago, we ended up going out to the Marine Corps boot camp, one of them, out in San Diego. It's a pretty interesting experience for me, previously having had nothing to do with the military. And this is the other end of that process. So when they leave the boot camp, or when they leave the processing station, they've got their packets, they fly to San Diego, they get off the bus, or they get off the plane, get off the bus, and they show up at boot camp. We watch the other end of that process, which nobody ever does. Nobody ever bothers to run these down. And so when you get off the bus, you've got a drill sergeant that's jumps on the bus and they're screaming at you, and they're sort of starting the brainwashing process. They think they keep them up for about 48 hours. But they jump on the bus, they're screaming at him, they're trying to get him in formation. And the Marines actually have these little yellow footprints that they use. They plant them on the ground. You're supposed to stand on them and stand at attention. And so they get them out there, they get them in a formation, and they tell them to throw their packets on the ground. They throw their packets on the ground. Well, guess what's happened in transit? That tape has come off, papers are loose, and so papers start blowing in the wind. And we're standing there watching this happen, and it's like people's social security numbers, there's your enlistment bonus blowing down the street, it's crazy. We're watching this happen, and the new Marines can't do anything about it, right? They're standing at attention, they're about to crap their pants because there's a drill sergeant screaming at them. What are they going to do? And that's their official record, getting torn apart. And the reason that happens is because we can't connect one system to another, because people don't talk to each other, because people don't think across their silos in government, and because there aren't enough technical people to know what an API even is, right? To be able to connect these services. And that's why it's important that we're here. So we're rebuilding that system, end to end. Our system isn't going to generate packets like that. It's going to send this data electronically. It's going to receive it from the recruiting commands, which feed people in, and it's going to send it to the personnel commands, which are responsible for making sure you get paid from day one, that you have your benefits, and that they know who you are when you arrive, because it turns out they don't even really have a roster either. I mentioned something about that system frozen in time, having been built in the early 90s. The longer I spend in government, the more I realize we really are frozen in time. We've gotten used to giving our service members and our citizens poorly built tools, and in the case of the military, whether it's business systems, whether it's combat or defense capabilities, it's really like giving these people dull knives to fight with. The funny thing is, though, I mentioned that our team is not really organic growth in the military. It's sort of weird that we're there. And that's because the system is working really entirely as it was designed. We write requirements, we farm things out to contractors, we have non-technical people managing those systems and managing those contracts. We don't really know how to hold people accountable. And we, meanwhile, especially at the DoD, we light money on fire, basically, building and maintaining things that take decades, years, if not decades, to finish if they ever do. Now, why does this matter? This can have incredible consequences. So, I'll give an example. There's a certain air platform, by that I mean a jet, that the Air Force builds. I won't say which one. And we actually we think of these jets, if you think of, let's say, the F-35 as an example, we actually call them data centers with wings because there's so much software that lives on these things nowadays. And each component has some related software that has to integrate with the core systems on that jet. But it turns out that the same vendors who are really good at building weaponry or building jets or building Humvees or what have you have started to provide the software for that as well. It's perhaps not the core competency of the same people. And the people managing those contracts are very used to buying, bullets and ships and planes and things like that. But they're not necessarily used to procuring software. And so what ends up happening is that there's not a whole lot of forethought that goes into how we actually integrate these components on a single jet. And so you might have a navigation system that doesn't talk to the takeoff and landing autopilot systems, that doesn't talk to various other parts of it. And the consequence of this was interesting and really shitty. We actually went out to a facility where they build these in Texas, and we found out that after a few hours in the air on a subset of missions, the cabin pressure system might forget that the jet is in the air, and the cabin just loses pressurization mid-flight. Now imagine if that happened on a commercial airplane, right? I mean, there would be front page stories about that. Pilots can pass out. I mean, it's not good. And that's a software problem. It's so stupid, but that's a software problem. It's another issue on long flights as well, where basically the GPS system that reports your current location and the navigation system run off of two different coordinate sets. And after a while, those start to drift. This, by the way, affects all the systems on the plane, including where they're sitting munitions. That's pretty bad. And so that resulted in, I think about 4 or 5% of missions being entirely scrubbed, which we're talking in the 7 and 8 figures money-wise, so we're just pouring down the drain with that. And so, think about it. That's the impact of software and just software integration when applied in that context. But it's all working as designed. The core problem here, I'm getting at, is that the technical talent has effectively left the building. You might have heard the term military grade used in a positive context before, right? Military grade encryption, military grade what have you. Doesn't really mean the same thing anymore, at least not from where I sit. And I think the reason for that is because we we have not done a good job of attracting, empowering, and retaining technical talent within our ranks. And in a lot of cases, people have figured out that they can go work for a contractor and make 3 times as much money. But the reality is that the mission is here. The mission is where we sit inside the Pentagon. And it's what we're empowered to work on every day. I mentioned we're a problem-solving group. One of the things that we have is we call it an open door policy. So we have an office just in the A-ring, we have a couple offices. We have one in the A-ring of the Pentagon. People can ring there's like a little doorbell, it's cute. You can ring the doorbell and we'll let you in. People just bring us their problems a lot. It's kind of interesting because a lot of kind of random people walk through that door. Everybody from generals and admirals to junior officers to enlisted, you name it. And we're happy to talk with them about the problems they're facing. But a lot of times we get people that come in and they think that we're an innovation group. And they want us to build them a dashboard that will give them visibility of the forces that they have at their command, or the movement of ships, or what have you, supply levels, things like that. Worse, a lot of times we get people who come in and it comes from a good place. They're struggling with technology that's not meeting their needs, but they'll come in and they'll just like spout off buzzwords, right? They're like, oh, we want to do this AI and machine learning concept with, with our data so that we can better predict what have you. And you like dig into it, you start asking them some questions, and you realize like they can't even get their Excel models through. And they're managing most of this stuff through PowerPoint slides right now. We have a sort of a joke we say a lot that like wars are fought and won and lost through Excel, PowerPoint, and SharePoint at the Department of Defense. It's pretty sad. And so we're not an innovation group. We're not going to sprinkle blockchain all over your problems. We are a problem-solving group. Remember, we call ourselves a SWAT team of nerds. We're here, we're pragmatists, as you can probably tell I'm talking about this. But we go through and we fix the horribly broken shit that exists everywhere. So instead, we focus on things that really matter. Fixing that air platform integration problem. Fixing things like GPS, the GPS. The military runs that. The thing that keeps you from driving into a lake is run by military satellites. Turns out, it took them, the folks that developed that, anytime they make a change, it would take them weeks or months to actually move the artifacts through a build pipeline to where they could actually test the code that they just wrote. We built them out a CI/CD pipeline that got it out the door in a matter of minutes. That's a major, major improvement. That's an order of magnitude impact. So we're not an innovation group. We don't upgrade workstations to Windows 10. And we're not going to build dashboards with AI and machine learning. But we will fix things like the issues that prevent service members from moving. Every 3 years, service members, or every 2 to 3 years, most service members do a thing called permanent change of station, or PCSing. It's a pretty painful process right now, in part because the software that manages that has under, before we came around, had under a 30% uptime. I don't know about you, but we tend to aim for like 5 nines of uptime. It's not really in the neighborhood. And we're also not a policy shop. So I mentioned that we hire engineers, we hire designers, we hire product managers. We hire people who want to get their hands dirty, who actually want to work on real, tangible problems and have a real impact. And we're pretty aggressively focused on getting shit done and delivering results for the department. So in this spirit, we actually set up something called, a program called the Jyn Urso program, named after a Star Wars character, to engage and better support technical talent within the military. So it turns out we have this thing called Cyber Command. There's US Cyber Command, and then the services all have their own. So there's Army Cyber Command, there's Fleet Cyber for the Navy, there's Marine Forces Cyber. So all the services have their own. And they have a lot of technical people within their not always applied to the right problem sets in ways where they can actually have an impact. And so we wanted to make the point that if you better empower the people that we already have here, the technical talent we already have here, you'll stop losing people, and you'll be able to produce some really valuable capabilities that actually have an impact. So to do that, we started off, we actually sort of kidnapped 6 really sharp junior Army officers. One of them was actually considered AWOL for a little bit because there was something about his records that weren't being kept up. I don't know. And in the commands that they were in, they weren't really able to apply their technical skills. We had a Navy ensign who was waiting on his clearance to come through, which, by the way, takes about 2 years because there's a backlog, because we're bad at this. He was waiting for his clearance to come through, and he was like counting push-ups. Happened to be extremely technical and wasn't using any of that knowledge on any of his projects. So we kidnapped these service members. We brought them into our office. We gave them new equipment. We gave them, empowered them with the tools that they need on day one. And we gave them a problem. We didn't give them a solution. We gave them a problem. And we said, solve this however you think best, and treat yourselves like an early stage startup, right? So we imagine, okay, let's say you just raised an angel round, you have a couple $100,000 in your pocket. What are you going to go do? You need to prove this out in the next few months. So you give them about 3 to 6 months and a couple $100,000 in funding. They operate relatively autonomously. We support them with product managers and designers from DDS. There are our civilian staff, because those are 2 positions that don't typically come out of government. And the first problem that we set them loose on is that ISIS and others have discovered that they can buy up consumer drones off the internet. Think like the quadcopter drones that you can buy on Amazon. They realize that they can attach explosives to the bottom of those, and they can fly them over our troops and allied troops in war zones in the Middle East in particular, and drop those explosives on them. And there was basically nothing we could do about it. The Army's official response to that for some time was, well, if you see one flying above you, just shoot at it. The Department of Defense has been trying to solve this problem for quite some time. It's spent about $700 million in R&D trying to get after this, farming out requirements to contractors, saying build us this, build us that. That produced such great innovative products as things like a net cannon. So rather than shooting bullets at it, you could shoot a net. Great stuff. And so we just gave our team this problem. We knew they had the right expertise. We said, come solve this problem. We'll give you whatever tools you need. In about 6 weeks, they produced a solution that actually works. They had tested it in the field. They'd actually gone to Iraq and tested this with soldiers in the operational environment. And they produced something that actually can attack the individual drone with precision electronically at a cost of under $20,000 per unit. And that's literally building them bespoke. So like one of our offices in the Pentagon, we had one of our big wooden tables, and we were like soldering the parts together on it and 3D printing the casing for it. Those are the types of results that we can deliver. Those systems are now deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Syria, in South Korea. That was recently used as part of President Moon's motorcade to protect the South Korean president. It's on the THAAD site in South Korea. We're starting to use it on domestic military bases here. There's a huge impact of that. And this is the power of bringing the engineers into the building and giving them a seat at the table and giving them a problem set and letting them loose on that. So we've continued with that program. We have been creating capabilities to to do things like better detect and hunt adversaries on our DoD networks. It turns out they're probably not as secure as we think they are. And so we're trying to figure out where adversaries might already be, and how do we track and understand their movements on those networks. We've done other projects like, with this program, like protecting our national airspace in partnership with the FAA. That's been a really cool one, to be able to work with them. They've actually been a really great partner. And we're only just getting started with that. And so our team, I keep mentioning, we're sort of this odd force inside the Pentagon. As we've grown, we've found we can take on bigger and bigger fights. And the more we deliver, the better the results we deliver, the more political capital we have to move on to the next bigger fight and the next bigger fight to keep working to improve technology in the Department of Defense. And so that leads me to this program called Hack the Pentagon. It's a great example of this. Any of you know what a bug bounty is? Do you know what a hackathon is? Okay, so some of you might have been to a hackathon. It's a similar sort of concept in that it's usually like a weekend or a 2-week, weekend or sometimes a little longer event. But what we actually do is we invite private security researchers, i.e. hackers, in. It's a pretty common practice in the private sector. We invite them in and we basically say, beat the shit out of our DoD systems. Find the vulnerabilities in the actual system. This is not on test sites, this isn't a sandbox or a dummy environment. It's, here's defense.gov, find all the vulnerabilities, right? And that's a pretty benign public-facing example. But we've actually started running bounties on private systems that should not be exposed to the internet, on classified systems, on a lot of really interesting targets, and finding a lot of really interesting data. Now, traditionally, in the federal government, it's actually been illegal to disclose vulnerabilities, or the idea is that it's illegal to compromise a US government system. So by disclosing a vulnerability, even if you just happen upon it, you can actually be prosecuted for that. We actually had that, one of our team members was threatened with that at one point for disclosing a vulnerability. And so to counter that, we've started up what's called the Vulnerability Disclosure Program, and working with Congress have started to change that and make it not only acceptable, but encouraged at any time for anybody to disclose a vulnerability in the US government system. And during bug bounties, you can actually be paid out a bounty based on the severity of the issue that you found. So Hack the Pentagon was the federal government's first bug bounty program. We've run a ton of these now. We ran Hack the Army. We did Hack the Marine Corps at DEF CON. We did Hack the Air Force, which is what you can see up here. So that's actually, I love this photo. This is a hacker that we brought in. There was probably, I think, 30 of them at this event. This is in an office in Manhattan. And we actually brought in the airmen who are responsible for defending these networks. And we had them sit with, or kind of wander around and understand what the hackers were doing, and understand the way that they think, because it turns out we're not actually teaching the people who defend these networks how adversaries think. And so, what you can see here is this lieutenant, watching this hacker actually get into one of their systems. And usually when we run these, the first vulnerabilities are found in a matter of minutes. And so it gets pretty interesting. We actually had, and these hackers come from all different backgrounds, right? So we actually had a 17-year-old kid named Jack Cable who actually joined our team as an intern this past summer. And the reason we recruited him to join as an intern is because over the last year, he made $180,000 as a 17-year-old in bounties, just from bounties at DoD systems, which is pretty cool. So we're expanding this program now, and we've added about $35 million to run bounties, as I mentioned, on public and private sites, including on classified assets. And Congress has actually just directed the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to work with our team to set up similar programs at those agencies. So in the process, this weird rebellion that we're a part of has grown in a lot of really great and unexpected ways. We've managed to work with secretaries and generals, here the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, to junior officers, to applicants for military service, to end users, to people who just interact with the military or receive services or benefits from the military. We worked with the Air Force and the U.S. Transportation Command on that system I mentioned that's responsible for moving service members and their families, which happens every summer. That's a $2 billion industry, and the Department of Defense is the largest consumer of moving goods and services in the United States. That's actually the team that worked on that. And so, as we grow this rebellion and start to build an insurgency, these are two of the soldiers that are part of the Generoso program. We're finding new and novel ways to bring in and better empower the talent that we already have in our ranks, because it's really critical that we do this. One of our values on the team, we actually have 6 core values that we go by. One of them is go where the work is. We are based in the Pentagon, but our team travels about half the time because we find that most of the problems, while they maybe originate in that 5-sided building, manifest themselves out in the field somewhere. We prioritize building with users, not for them. In fact, we have right now, these pictures are a little older, that's actually that's on the very right there on the helmet. Right now, actually, we have about 8 members of our team over in Afghanistan as we speak, working with General Miller out there to troubleshoot some software that may have contributed to some of the stuff that you've seen on the news recently. So this is timely, this is important, and a lot of the things that we see are actually rooted in software problems. And it's usually really dumb stuff that really should make you angry as a technical person. And so we go where the work is and we actually fix those problems. We have another saying at DDS, we say no one is coming, it's up to us. And that really couldn't be more true. The first few months in government, and I still sometimes feel this way, you see some of the problems that exist and you think, like, gosh, this is so bad. There's got to be some, team of people that can come in and solve these things, and this can't just be it, right? Like, there's got to be something else, some other way to solve this. Someone else is paying attention to this, right? And we realize that's actually us. Like, that's why we're here, even though it sometimes doesn't feel like we fit into that department. We realize that's why we are needed. And not just we, EDS, USDS, but we technical people. The government needs people who understand, who care about the mission, who care about this country, and who understand software and technology and are willing to sacrifice a little bit and apply those skills to have orders of magnitude impact on a mission that really is incredibly important. I'm going to stop there. I want to leave time for questions. I could go on with tons of stories, but thank you. Yeah.
I have a comment, 2 follow-up questions. So in terms of the software technology, you mentioned it was outdated, it wasn't time, whatnot. So a couple of things that I noticed while working with the DOD was in regards to a lot of software, a big aspect of that is security of it. So as you know, for the DOD, you can't have open source software, right? It has to be represented by a legitimate centralized entity. You can't have non-compliant software frameworks, and even if you do, the adaptation of those frameworks is very slow. So the process of actually being able to use those, sometimes I will say, okay, go ahead, it's very slow. And the second thing is that, so the environment that the software is built on has to basically be centralized by the DOD, right? So the DOD is very about maybe like exporting or outsourcing their own systems. So yeah, once again, get autonomy in that field too. So my two questions are, have you guys actually looked into the policies of adapting software and whatnot? And how do you maintain autonomy for the community? How do you maintain that kind of peace of mind when you develop, these technologies or whatever you do outsource stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to just pull up this site real quick. We actually operate this site called code.mil. This is sort of an offshoot of code.gov, which is another, more broadly focused on the federal government. We are tackling this problem. So we care about not only the ability to use open source projects within Department of Defense systems, but also the opportunities that can exist by open sourcing our own unclassified software and just putting that out there. So, like for us, our team actually runs the Department of Defense GitHub account, GitHub organization. You can see it's fairly active. We actually host things a little bit separately that are fully open source, but it's run through this program called code.mil. So we advocate for that. It's funny, a lot of our work ends up crossing over into policy, but we typically start with a tangible problem set. So I mentioned we're not a policy shop. Like if you tried to throw me into a policy organization, I'd be totally fucking lost. Like I wouldn't have a clue what I'm doing. But we know how to solve problems, and we know how to identify those problems, and we know from our experience outside of government what makes sense and what doesn't. And so we start typically with programs like this, and then we actually tend to let the policymakers react to that. We have a pretty unique thing that we do actually cut through a lot of the initial pieces of that and get those proofs of concept out there. We actually have a waiver authority, so we can write a memo, and with that memo, we can waive any DoD policy or regulation, including service-specific ones. And so one of the policies that we waive a lot is this thing called the RMF, the Risk Management Framework, which is exactly what you were talking about, which is what slows people down in terms of getting the security assessments and getting systems launched. What we usually do is we'll waive things to show a better way of doing things, and then we'll take that back to the policymakers and say, look how we did this. See, there's a better way of doing this that gets us to the same result, gets us to a better result, and we try to work with them on that. The code.mil is one example. We actually, and actually I would say in the last NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, this is the bill that Congress passes every year. It's usually a pretty big deal. Well, they pass most years, I should say. That basically funds the military. And there's usually a bunch of riders and provisions thrown in it. And one of the things we actually got into an early draft of it this year, or this past year, didn't make it into the final version because a lot of people didn't like it. But what we threw in there was a provision saying that all new custom-built unclassified software for the Department of Defense must be provided open source. So, in other words, the problem that we see is a ton of proprietary software that bogs us down in a lot of areas. You think about like the jet, the air platform stuff. Like there's so much proprietary stuff, and in those cases, the reason they don't talk about integrating the components with each other on the software level is because it's like 15 different contractors that run it all, and they all consider everything super proprietary, and they don't want to share. So that's the first piece. The second piece you asked about was the infrastructure, and DoD wanting to own everything. Right? So the Department of Defense operates about 7,000 data centers around the world. I'm using that term loosely again, but things that resemble data centers. That's a massive footprint. Turns out there are companies that also do that, and that are actually really good at that. It's amazing. And so one of our projects is, which I didn't mention, is called JEDI, the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure. That is the official name of it. It's pretty great. And what we're doing with that is we are running a procurement running an acquisition to acquire cloud services, commercial cloud services for the entire Department of Defense. Because right now, they'll say, oh, we can get to the cloud, we can do this, we can do that, or whatever. Good luck actually doing it, because if you want to buy cloud services, you've got to run the full acquisition yourself. Most people probably aren't familiar with what to even ask for. So it might take them 12 to 18 to 24 months just to buy it. This is, by the way, you can go to Google Cloud Platform and sign up for an account. Like they could do it right now in front of you. It takes us 24 months to do that sometimes. Let alone how to assess the security posture of a cloud platform. The department has not yet figured that out. They really know how to assess the physical security of a server closet, but they don't understand when somebody else owns those servers, what can we actually put on them. So what JEDI allows us to do, and that's in process right now, it's probably going to be awarded sometime early next year, is it'll allow system owners, people who own the software that runs on, right now a lot of on-premise systems, to easily migrate their information, their systems, their data to the cloud, and to not have to go through the whole contract and acquisition process. It's already taken care of for them, it's paid for, they just move their systems in, and we have a team of people that help them do that. This is a big contract, by the way. It's up to a $10 billion value over 10 years. So this is a pretty massive scale we're talking about. And it's like crazy that our little team of people in hoodies is actually doing this, but we are. That environment, by the way, will also be part of the requirement is that it be able to process unclassified, secret, top secret, and above compartments with parity to what's offered commercially. So without getting rid of services as you go up the classification stack. That's a pretty lofty requirement. It's one that we think is really important. Yeah.
You heard of the Army Futures Command at all?
I have. Yeah.
What's your
I met, I forget the general's name, but I met him a month ago, yeah.
That's first.
So I think that, they're just getting started, right? I think there's a great opportunity there. I'm actually pretty excited about it. I think that General Murray, I think that's who it is, has the right idea about it. There's such an opportunity because they're hiring 500 people down in Austin, Texas, which is where they're basing that. They are reassigning a lot of other commands under them. So I would say remains to be seen how that organization is actually going to play out. But I think the message that the Army is sending by standing that up as a new 4-star command is really quite important. They're just in the early stages of it. They're trying to hire 500 people by, I think, 2021, which is still, still fairly ambitious. And so, we're working with him and his team on helping to identify talent for that, helping to try and structure the organization in the right way. But because it's so new, they are fairly open to things. And I think that there's a lot of goodness in that. And knowing some of the commands that they're rolling under, I think it makes a lot of sense. Because right now, a lot of what we see, not just in the Army, but in other services, is a lot of groups being siloed. So there's a lot of good work that happens at the Department. There's a lot of really great work that happens at the Department of Defense. But a lot of times it's in pockets and silos, and you've got to kind of dig around and go find it. And a lot of it's because they're tucked away in different commands and don't necessarily talk to each other. And so I think there's a lot of promise with what they're doing with futures, and I think that Joel Murray is a good person to find. So, yeah.
So you've been active for about 4 years or so. You've covered some of your high-profile public victories. What about your high-profile public losses or defeats or black eyes or false starts or whatever the right word is?
So
surely in 4 years you've acquired some.
Yeah, so I'll give just caveat, you know, I'm like with Jedi, for example. I don't know that we've had many defeats on that, but we have had our fair share of negative press on it. If you can set up a Google alert on it like I do, and it's pretty interesting. Yeah, anything that's that high profile is going to be attacked by somebody somewhere. I think one of the things that we identified that I mentioned is the issue with attracting, engaging, and retaining talent, both on the military and civilian side. Sort of related to that, on the military side in particular, is training, and training the people who are supposed to be technical. So people like the airman that was in that slide with the hacker, you know, a lot of them go through, you know, for him to be the 24th Air Force, Army Cyber Command, what have you, they go through a cyber training program. It's actually, a lot of it's administered by the Navy, and the other services just pay them. And there's a lot of problems with it. It's not what it could be, I'll say that. And it takes longer than it could. And so we had an idea to launch sort of a pilot for the Army of a way to do that training, to conduct that training differently. To bring in people from the private sector who maybe do this sort of professional development type training for companies or just for, you know, people who sign up independently, and try to have them actually train up our sort of junior military officers. And while I wouldn't say that it's not as high profile as something like Jedi, but it didn't go quite the way we thought it would. But we actually think that's okay, right? I would call it a failure, frankly. And I think that's okay. We called it a pilot. We said we want to try this. We're not sure if it's going to work, but we got to try something. And we learned a whole hell of a lot from it. And so we're actually doubling back down on that effort now. And we're trying to play with what were the problems with the way that we set up the curriculum for that course, what are the problems with, you know, instructors and the classroom environment and all the different things that kind of went into what are the reasons that failed, and trying to work through improving that. We think that's really the best way to handle it, and it happens. People understand.
So as your organization has existed and has accumulated more wins, are you becoming more or less risk averse? I mean, at some point, it's the natural progression of any organization. Right?
Yeah. So one of the key things about our organization, and I mentioned this early on, is that we're all term appointees, so we're all government civilians, except for the active duty folks we bring in. But we're here on a short-term deal, right? We can't be here longer than 4 years. I think the average tenure of a USDSer is about 1.5 years. So everybody, including leadership, gets kicked out at the end of that. And part of the reason for that, or a side effect of it, is that we're not here to entrench ourselves. We're not here to build our own bureaucracy. We're not here to advance through the ranks of government. None of us really care about that. We care about solving problems. And the day that we stop solving problems, you would hear our leadership say this, like, the day that we stop solving problems, shut it down, close it, we're done. And we're not afraid to take on, because we take on bigger and bigger fights. There are some times where, you know, we'll take on one fight, we'll take on the next one, we'll take on the next one, and oop, that's a little too far, we didn't quite win that one, we'll go over here, we'll try it a little bit differently, right? That happens a lot before we even get to the full-blown sort of project scale. But the way that we do that is by staying tolerant of the risks that we know we have to take. We have a saying also at DBS that we've mitigated all the risk at the expense of all forward progress. And that's truly what we feel like the government likes to do, and so we are very careful to avoid that. And I think that part of again, a side effect of us kind of shedding our skin every so often and bringing in new people is, constantly having to recruit, constantly having to really think about these questions, being able to challenge the assumptions upon which the team is built, and being cognizant that if we stay too long, we become part of the machine that we're trying to fix.
So, somewhat related question as far as recruiting. Given that recently announced Amazon's going to arrive in Northern Virginia with 50,000 jobs, whatever it is this going to make DDS easier or harder?
It's funny, I was thinking when they made that announcement, and there were so many rumors beforehand, when they made that announcement, and they're actually moving to Crystal City, they're basically renaming Crystal City, I think, but moving to Crystal City, which if you know the geography of that area is like right across the highway from the Pentagon. And I was thinking, I get on the metro every day to go to work, and there's usually a fair number of military folks on that metro line because it stops right at the Pentagon. And I was thinking, God, I can't wait until there's like a bunch of nerds in hoodies like on this thing right into their jobs at Amazon, and like the collisions that are going to happen as part of that. Like I think it's actually going to be really awesome. I mean, I think we should embrace it, right? I think that I think that it's interesting. You look at some of the other, you look at some companies in the Valley in particular, and some of the sort of recent open letters that have come out, things like Project Maven at Google, where employees have protested them working with the Defense Department. And I understand that. I absolutely think that people should have a conscience about what they're doing. Even ourselves at the DoD, we need to, and we struggle with that at DDS too. We talk about it openly. But I also think there is such a communication and culture gap where those two worlds don't understand one another. And I think a lot of times it's easy to get caught up and not realize how critical the work that these people in uniform do every single day. And I think that having that presence in the same city, let alone right across the highway, I think is really great. I don't think it's going to hurt recruiting because I think this mission will always be this mission. We're always going to have that. We don't have a ton of money to throw at people. That might hurt, but otherwise, I think our pitch is still the same. We actually want government to do more hiring like the way we do it, where it's more a revolving door between the private sector and public sector and even the military, rather than expecting people to come in and work a 30-year career in government, retire with their pension and so on, right? So why can't we go back and forth between all the great tech companies that are in DC and in other cities and government?
A lot of the problems that you're talking about are legacy driven, right? And many of the links in that chain of legacy applications, or one legacy application provides input to another, which provides to another, and so forth. You can't fix one without breaking three more, in many cases. Which means that every time you have a success, there's other organizations that will probably regard it as a failure because you broke their application. How does your little team of 200 overcome something like that?
So we tend to think that the scope of the impact that we can have across government is not limited to the systems that we work on. A lot of what we find is that the problems we have, it's talent, it's understanding acquisition, it's having technical people in the right places, and so on. But it goes back to culture in a lot of cases, and this sort of risk-averse culture that we've built around really everything, but around software in particular. And so we actually see one of our primary impacts being the sort of second and third order cultural effects that come after we do a thing. The General Sub program is a great example of that, where we bring in members of the military to work on hard problems. People want to be a part of that, and commanders are taking notice, and reorient their operations to try and mirror the work that we're doing. It's not easy to do by any means from either side, but I think that's a big piece of it. Now, from the technical perspective, it's definitely a challenge that we've got to deal with. That's part of the sort of unique role of a product manager that we have at DBS or at USDS is, we look for people who we think can probably tolerate a large bureaucracy that doesn't care about them and will crush them if they don't know how to stand up to it. We look for people who understand how to think about large systems like this and understand that they're not going to solve every problem all at once. There are some days I go into work, usually Monday mornings, and still think I can just solve all this stuff because I see so many dumb things happening. And then you realize you can't, but you can make an impact in ways that are really, really important. And so I think it goes back to scoping things properly, ensuring we have backward compatibility where we can, understanding it's not going to be perfect, but getting something out the door is really, really important. And then work with your partners on either side to help them get their systems up to where they need to be. So in the example of the military enlistment program, that system talks to a ton of other systems. It receives data from all 5 services, only 3 of which actually use software to process their applicants. 2 of them use paper. But it receives data from those 3 systems, it pushes it out to HR systems on the other side, and then it launches a bunch of checks in the middle to OPM. It runs a background check through the FBI. It runs you through USCIS to validate citizenship, Social Security to validate your SSN, things like that. And we know we can't fix all those systems and all those agencies, but we do work with, on the military side, those stakeholders on either end of it to make sure that they can still pass some data through it. Any others? Cool.
All right, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And we're having a lunch with Patrick, so if you're interested in joining us for that, come see me and I'll get you on the list and let you know what we'll be doing. Thanks.
Yeah, so we techniques, we try to keep things as classification as possible. Classify things. So we have to be pretty strong for keeping things unclassified. Also because we can use our like we can use our tools on the class side. A lot easier than on my side. The other thing we do is we escalate people's practices a lot. So we have one before Reddit things like that. We end up sort of using those to make sure that we process in time. We have that instances, it's not perfect, we have that instances finish their tour of duty and they've been out for 4 months and an investigator calls them out, they have to write an investigation process for
guys, you know, that General Baker?
I was just emailing General Barrett, who just took command yesterday.
I was General Baker's company commander
Okay.
when he was out in 7th Signal.
Yep. We're, I think, about to crush 7th Signal on something. We were trying to get an exception to get Google Apps, like G Suite, unblocked for a particular command.
Yeah.
Turns out they're doing some DNS poisoning on it, Army-wide. So it's got to go through RCC CONUS
Yep, I used to be their company
under
commander.
7 SIG. And so they have basically told us if we unblock it for this one command, because it's DNS level, it's got to be unblocked for all of CONUS, all Army sites CONUS. And
It's
so
the public-facing website.
so I sent that to General Barrett, and I said, hey, can we unblock this? She's like, we're on it, thanks. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect that to happen. So yeah, no, we work with them. General Baker's a great guy too.
DTMS, talk to me about that. Have you guys got into that?
TMS.
Defense Training Management System.
No,
Sucks.
we haven't. Yeah, no, I know it's awful.
It's like,
DTS.
yeah, DTS
Just that, but-
sucks a little bit, but,
Yeah.
so you do your training on, what is it, Army ATMS or ALS, Army Learning Management System,
Mhm.
and then DTMS is the system that tracks it, like they never talk back and forth. They were getting it to where like, all right, I finished my course, it automatically uploads into DTMS.
Yep.
Before it was like, I finished my course, somebody had to email the training guy, and he goes in, says, okay, they completed the training.
Yeah.
Of course, we had like 365 people, one dude uploaded the training that you didn't get off training. So it was always, I was the company commander, so that was my job, was to make sure
Yeah.
it was in your mandatory training.
Yeah, for us, it's not actually recorded anywhere. We still have to do those, but you can imagine our team taking the cybersecurity training that they do. It's pretty fun.
That's a fun training.
And they give you that certificate at the end, but that's the only proof that you did it for us. So, yeah. Now we've had people bring that to us that